Hello, good evening, and welcome. I'm Simon Bestwick.
And I am Gemma Files. And this, of course, is No
No
Darkness
darkness but
But
ours.
Ours, the podcast in which two horror writers talk about, strangely, horror.
Or talk bollocks, depending on who you ask.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, there's a fair amount of bollocks, but also a fair amount of horror. And God knows the two cross over sometimes.
Now I should probably mention to our listeners, we record these podcasts a few weeks in advance. So at the time we're recording, Gemma's actually just come back from Necronomicon,
Yeah,
which I'm guessing was I get the impression you had a hell of a good time there.
I really did. It was, I love Necronomicon generally. The panels are always great. There's a nice kind of academic slant to it, but not a crazy highbrow academic slant to it. And I just really love talking to people, and whether it's behind a desk or in the lobby or in the bar. Though I myself do not drink these days.
No, it's just nice when you actually catch up with somebody and you can just talk about the weird shit that you're into with somebody who's also into some of that weird shit. Which, let's
Definitely.
face it, in the normal run of things, if you have those that, well, I mean, I don't think either of us have a normal office job any longer, thank God. But when you do, it's kind of like everyone else is talking about, reality TV, God help us, or other stuff that you're not, and you're just like, so yeah, I watched it. What did you watch last night? I said, well, I watched this really cool film where, where somebody, where these monsters took over a hospital and a guy's skin melted off, and like,
Yeah, yeah. A man's
hey.
pineal gland came out and kind of licked around like a weird tongue.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, try explaining From Beyond to somebody who hasn't unfamiliar with
yeah, yeah.
that. Oh, God.
Interdimensional space worms make you horny. That's
Absolutely.
yeah. That's
That
pretty
always
much
have
the
that
only
effect
way
on
you
me
can.
anyway.
Yeah, only way you can do it. Yeah. So there was a lot of there were a lot of furtive but happy conversations about things like meat mushrooms and carcinization, which is people turning into crabs, because
Yes.
apparently everything turns into crabs eventually.
Yeah, I've heard of this sort of assertion. I'm not quite sure how they work that one out, but I kind of like crabs.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
soft shell, deep fried soft shelled ones are particularly nice. But
Well, I'm pretty
uh,
sure humans would be fairly soft shelled were we to turn into crabs.
depending if we melted our exoskeletons or you vey. would deep fried soft shelled humans be kosher? There's one too.
No, no, they wouldn't, because they would be something that crawled at the bottom of the sea, which is definitely not kosher. Um, she said with great authority, not not being Jewish or anything. At any rate, so we were going to talk about folk horror,
Yeah,
which
which
makes total sense because cosmic horror and folk horror, to some degree, two opposite ends of the spectrum. But on the other hand, I'm under the impression that they can also cross over more than a
yeah,
little bit.
yeah,
Um,
I think
yeah,
definitely, because both of them have. I mean, both. I mean, we probably need one of the things I think we need to probably do, we were going to do at the beginning of this really is to try and work towards a kind of general definition of folk horror, because as
exactly.
well as the kind of the classic stuff that we're used to, the kind of formative stuff like Blood on Satan's Claw, the Wicker Man, and various others. You can also go back retroactively to writers like
Witchfinder
James
general,
Black.
basically.
But I mean,
The three that people usually talk about as being like the beginning of the folk horror ideal are Blood on Satan's Claw, as you said, The Wicker Man, and Witchfinder General.
oh yes,
Yeah,
yes, all of the others. I mean, yeah, I mean, I was just checking it before the podcast just to look at exactly when the term folk horror was coined, and it wasn't yet 90. It was specifically coined to refer to the Blood on Satan's Claw. But as you say, you've got these both the Wicker Man and Witchfinder General tap a similar kind of vein. All three films are very different, but at the same time they have that common thread. Of course, what we immediately think of as folk horror as well, that is quite a Eurocentric thing. And of course, if we look further afield, I think one of the things we were talking before the podcast about the Guatemalan film La Llorona,
Yes.
as an example of folk horror.
And I think the thing that really needs to be said right up front is that folk horror has to do with folklore, and no culture on earth has has the lock on folklore.
Absolutely.
And there's when we look backwards, we can talk about Orientalism, we can talk about the denigration of the folklore of other cultures as being just superstition, and it's like silly, animistic, pagan BS, but really the point is that every culture has its folklore.
Yes. Yeah.
It's sort of secret vein of things that came before and have supposedly been, are supposedly over and done with, but not really.
Yeah, I think we've had this conversation before about the idea of folklore, folk music, folk everything, essentially being a way of communicating knowledge outside official channels. It's kind of a kind of secret popular history handed down often orally.
Yes,
but as well, I mean, in a way, this is where perhaps some of the overlap with cosmic horror can come, in that, but in both folk horror and in cosmic horror, there is the idea that there's how we think the world works, what we think the world is about, and then there is both of them say, well, actually no, there's this other stuff that underlies it,
exactly,
that's completely at odds with your anthropocentric, rationalistic, scientific kind of worldview.
There's types of cosmic horror where it's like the secret that nobody understands is that there is nothing behind everything. And in folk horror, on the other hand, a lot of the time, the secret that nobody understands is that there is something behind everything, except it's probably not the thing that you hope it was.
There's a lot of, I mean, I was kind of like making some notes earlier about trying to kind of work towards some sort of broad definition. And again, of course, a lot of my terms of reference have been, again, quite Eurocentric, kind of thinking in terms of Britain and North America. But I mean, obviously, they're mostly, but not always, rural. Usually, and is often cast in terms of there being some sort of atavistic or usually pre-Christian force that breaks through kind of civilized behavior, and that's as likely to stem from the human character, from human psychology, as it is from the supernatural. Like Witchfinder General, there's nothing supernatural about the cruelty and the evil in that. You have the corruption, in authority figures, you have all the kind of chaos caused by times of war, you have the kind of cruelty and the human baseness and fear and anger that that arise naturally in times of crisis, and that look for scapegoats, that look for victims.
Absolutely. Human sacrifice is like a huge integral part of a lot of folk horror. The idea that people are chosen, people are singled out. The idea that the idea of a witch hunt, like figurative witch hunt, even if it's not a literal witch hunt.
Whether I mean, the sacrificial aspect can either be in the sense of we're making someone the scapegoat for everything that's wrong, or we're choosing someone to offer up as a sacrifice to the gods.
Yes.
I mean, from the point of view of how the person being done in is regarded, there can be a very different attitude there. But from the point of view of the poor bastard who's getting sacrificed, it kind of ends the same way.
Exactly. I mean, that's one of the things about the Wicker Man, right? I'm gonna, spoilers, but on the other hand, it's been out for like what, 40 years?
Been out for a while.
Spoilers is, we've got a guy who is a intense Christian. And one assumes that he aspires to be like Christ, but does he aspire to be like Christ in that he is an innocent person sacrificed to redeem redeem or fix an entire culture?
Yeah, well, I mean, as Christopher Lee says to him, as a Christian, we offer you something that's very rare in this day and age: a Christian martyr's death.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I remember I got to see what they call what they call referred to as the final cut of this. This was like the kind of the definitive director's cut, as part of the screen as part of Grimfest in Manchester. We actually got to meet the Robin Hardy was actually
cool.
Was actually there. It was actually his birthday, so we actually got cake as well, which was
wow.
Cool.
Did it look like a giant Wicker Man?
No, it doesn't look like a cake. But I mean, he said he'd always seen the film as a comedy, and it is. And especially when you look at it from the villager's point of view, because on the one hand, the Edward Woodward character is on the viewed from one perspective. He is, a righteous man who is on what he sees as an important mission, which is to save the life of a child, and he won't let anything get in his way. But viewed from another angle, he's a humorless prig who is just ripe for guying, for taking the piss out of, for making a fool of, which is literally, of course, what they do before the final sacrifice. And I think
and at any point he could have excused himself from this whole thing. All it would take would be, I don't know, going next door and fucking the beautiful woman who wants to have sex with him.
Exactly. But of course, he's been chosen specifically for those personal qualities that will ensure he won't do that.
Yes, exactly.
If he did go and fuck Britt Eklund, then and let's face it, I think most people in that situation very likely would have. But if he had gone and done that, then he wouldn't have been the guy that they were looking for, because apart from anything else, they were after a virgin. And let's face it, the kind of person who would have gone, oh, the hell with it, and run next door to do the nasty with them, probably wouldn't have been a virgin by the age of 30 odd when they came to the island in the first place.
It's true.
So, not by choice anyway, depending on how poor your social skills were. But so there is that kind of thing. I think Anthony Schaefer said that he didn't see the villagers in the Wicker Man as evil. They're people who are doing what they see as right. You've got two different belief systems here.
Yeah.
Viewed from a Christian perspective, how he does is exactly does the right thing. Exactly what the right thing to do is. From the villagers' perspective, they're doing what the right thing to do is. They are working to preserve their community.
Yeah, absolutely. And the intersection of two equally passionate zealotry is part of the whole power of that.
Yeah, and it's not filmed like a horror film. It is filmed almost at times like a documentary. And at other times, it's filmed very much for the humour of it. I believe it was a big influence on the League of Gentlemen.
Yeah, no, I can't see that it wouldn't be, really.
Yeah, it'd be very hard for it not to be.
Yeah. So this idea of secret knowledge that you stumble across, where you are enticed, or perhaps you fall into a place where everybody is acting according to a very different set of plans than the ones that you consider quote quote natural, real, normal. That's like a big thread of folk horror. The other thing that I would point out is that a lot of folk horror has to do with not just secret history, but forgotten history, buried history.
Yeah. I mean, even at its simplest, so many traditional ghost stories of which kind of we can retroactively work under the umbrella of folk horror are about some long ago murder that needs to be discovered, not even necessarily punished, but simply brought to light, so that the body can be given a decent burial, or that somebody who's been thought to have been a suicide can be, or a murderer can have their name retroactively cleared. It's about setting the record straight.
They want their story told. It
Yes.
doesn't matter whether it's told to everybody or whether it's just told to one person, that they want one person to know the truth of
Yes.
what was actually going on. It's like,
Exactly.
was this person a saint, or were they a witch? Was this person, a murderer, or were they doing something which was necessary? Was
Another
it?
thing.
Yeah,
Another
sorry,
thing that
go on.
struck me, and it kind of, in a way, this kind of goes back to the subject matter of our first podcast when we were talking about all the white spaces and about other kind of horror fiction that was set in very extreme situations. Now, while the countryside isn't, the countryside isn't by any means like, like the Arctic, and that's possibly certain reaches of Canada, maybe in winter. Possibly some reaches of Britain, maybe this winter, we'll find out.
Well, the funny part is that, it doesn't have to be during winter. The fact is that if you get lost in the woods, it doesn't matter what woods you get lost in or when you get lost there. You could die. You could, in fact, die.
People, you're thrown back. You're thrown back onto your own resources in a way, even in quite mild ways. When I wrote for the novel The Hollows. I spoke to a friend of mine who lives in a village very like the one in which it's set in, and she was saying, in winter we will sometimes get snowed in and we'll be cut off for several days. Also, there's a very strong community ethic in a place like that. There has to be, because often at times you have to be able to rely on your neighbors, and you have to be able to help your neighbors. You help your neighbors out. So people are kind of forced into dealing. It's like we talked about when you're trying to penetrate the dead space of the Arctic or the Antarctic. Elements of what is necessary for survival come to the fore, and elements of that, perhaps on a not as extreme a scale, are there as well when you're in a rural setting, because so many of the accoutrements that we take for granted if we live in the city just are not there. And
exactly.
And things that we would not expect, we don't expect to see day to day in the city. I mean, a friend of mine, and I don't know how accurate this is, he may have been exaggerating slightly for effect, but he said, if you live more than 4 miles away from some kind of, major settlement, not necessarily a city, but even like a town or any kind of major built-up area, you'll probably own a gun.
Yeah.
Something like even if it's something like a shotgun or a small bore rifle, something like that may well actually be a necessity. Now, for most people, in some parts of America, it's a constitutional right to buy, a belt-fed machine gun from the post office. That's maybe not the best.
I'm sorry, $150 and then pose with them. But it's true that if you lived in Alaska or really even northern Ontario, you might come into contact with animals that you needed to scare away from your house. Bears, for example. Even small bears are still bears.
Yeah, I'm not fucking with bears.
Yeah, no. There's no point in fucking around with bears.
Although there was actually a Canadian.
Yeah, I knew it. I knew you were thinking of that. Yeah, bear, bone and penis. My husband, it's me. Yes. Don't have sex with a bear just because you can.
But you can't. Well, you possibly may be able to, but you won't live to tell anyone about it. I took a brief break in North Wales, near where my dad grew up, and at one point I was stuck because there's one train in that part of the world, and it doesn't come along very often. I'd missed one. I was going to be waiting around for about an hour and a half, and I tried to ring for a taxi, and he said, "Well, it's going to cost you about 30 quid." I was like, "What?" Because as a crow flies, it's not a big journey, but he was going to have to come quite a long way around, and he was the only taxi around.
Yeah.
So it was, in an urban setting, you just take for granted you'll be able to
get another taxi. Yeah, if you don't like that taxi driver, or if you don't want to pay 30 quid, or if whatever, that you have options. But in the country, not so much. The other thing, so this thing about relying on your neighbors reminds me very much of a line from 30 Days of Night. David Slade's 30 Days of Night, where there's a guy who lives a little further out from everybody else, and the only time he comes into town, he's super grumpy and usually parks his, truck in the wrong place or his snowplow in the wrong place. And pretty much always the only interaction that he has with people is getting ticketed. and he's always like, oh, Eben, you don't have to do that. You don't have to. And, meanwhile, Eben, the sheriff or the whatever, the guy who gives out tickets is like, yeah, no, I kind of really have to. It's like, no, I mean, you really didn't have to. Well, yeah, but he lives so far out of town. He needs to be reminded that he lives here. He lives near people. That we live here too.
There are rules. Yeah.
Yeah. And that sense of community is also part of folk horror, which is kind of interesting that, you, whether you want to be or not, are part of a network of people who are bound together by landscape, bound together by proximity, and perhaps bound together by the secret knowledge.
Funny enough, one of the things that sort of social media really kind of underlines to you is the kind of double-edged nature of community, of solidarity. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, it's an incredibly powerful force to feel you're part of, to have behind you if you're up against something. On the other hand, if you find yourself out of step with popular opinion on some respects, or you feel that there's some ambiguity or complexity to something, and it's not something as simple and clear cut as what the consensus seems to be. Yeah. It can become something actually quite frightening.
You can feel like people turn on you on a dime, and suddenly you're the person who's, it's like a flock of starlings pecking away at something, or crows. It's like a pack. And suddenly you're the
people
prey.
Do it without realizing as well, because there's a quote at the end of a Harlan Ellison story, which is like, no appropriate choice of word considering social media. It's like, no single snowflake in an avalanche feels responsible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes. You might just think you're saying, oh, you're being what? Stop being such a tit or whatever.
Yeah.
But if you're one of like hundreds of people bombarding somebody with that reply on Twitter or Facebook, you become, without necessarily intending to, part of this kind of blizzard.
Yeah, exactly. And making them, so you become like a part of a natural force, but it's an unnatural natural force, which is kind of interesting. Ramsey Campbell is incredibly good at flipping that particular script, and at giving this. With things like The Hungry Moon, he really gives this impression of, like a tight-knit community of people in a tiny little town, and who have no one to rely on except each other, and maybe they hate each other, but they also, on an individual basis, but they also have this weird kind of allegiance to the idea of the town. The idea of like a standard that everyone should be living up to or living down to, whatever, it's like everybody should be, there are certain rules, and of course there are unspoken rules, secret knowledge, right? Certain rules that everyone has to keep to, and a certain standard that everybody has to set and again keep to. And if you don't, if you step out of line, things start to disintegrate, and everyone's super afraid of that kind of disintegration. And it's sort of like I remember watching what is that Alfred Hitchcock movie with Big Charlie and Little Charlie, the uncle who's the serial killer, and the niece who lives in a small town. And 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 again, maybe because he was coming at it from the outside, with things like The Trouble with Harry as well. When Hitchcock shows you a small American town, it's sort of like, oh, this is so beautiful, this is so lovely. It's like everybody's, it's like white picket fences, and everybody's friend, and everybody's big brother and big sister. But at the same time, things happen like, young Charlie is crossing the road real fast at one point, and it's a really small road, and the local cop is like, hey, slow down, Charlie, I'm going to tell your parents about you. I'm just like, oh my God, that's horrifying, because I've lived in the city my entire life.
There is that thing of everybody, yeah, there is that kind of like almost like Bentham's panopticon.
Yes, exactly. It's exactly like that. That the happy panopticon,
and so in a way,
it's like the lottery. It's like Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. It's like we all get together and we have a fun time, and then at the end of the day, somebody picks the black rock.
I mean, often in small communities, somebody gets stoned, but it's usually sort of sort of in a far more benign sense than that. But I mean, in terms of secret knowledge, I'm thinking of another Ramsey Campbell story, Dolls. And with the idea of the coven that's formed out of people. I mean, it's to kind of escape in that sense. The secret knowledge is a kind of subversive. It's a kind of way of it's a kind of a place for all the kind of thoughts and behaviors and impulses that cannot find an expression in that sort of panopticon of the rural community, because it's under everyone's watching you. But if you book off to the woods and put on a mask and
yes, exactly. The Hitchcock film that I'm thinking of is Shadow of a Doubt, 1943.
I have not even heard of that one, but we do have
really. Joseph Cotton plays Big Charlie.
Okay.
Yeah, and
that shall be hunted.
Teresa Wright, I think, is Little Charlie. Anyways, it's very well worth your time. Oh, and it reminds me a lot of Stoker, that film that Park Chan-wook did. In
Matthew Good.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Which is kind of like a riff on the Shadow of a Doubt model. I'm not sure whether anybody else saw that, but they should have, because it's pretty obvious.
Talking of folk horror, I mean, going back to the sort of a lot of the kind of the earlier stuff. I mean, well before the films, there was actually a stage play. It was staged by the Royal Shakespeare Company. It caused a huge outcry when it happened.
Yes.
And in many ways prefigures a lot of things, and it was written by David Rodkin, who
the same guy who wrote Penda's Fen.
Exactly, Penda's Fen, Artemis 81, which isn't quite folk horror, but is again this wonderfully strange, visionary work of fiction. I think he rather resists the description of horror writer, but so much of his stuff falls under the banner of the weird, the strange, and of course he adapted The Ash Tree for BBC's Ghost Stories.
Yeah, that's a great adaptation, and and he kind of crosses over to some degree with Nigel Neal, though he's not as scientifically minded as Nigel Neal.
True, but A Fortnight Come, the play that he wrote, has no supernatural element to it at all, but it's essentially a bunch of labourers in the Black Country around Birmingham. It's a pear orchard. They're trying to get all the pears picked. The title comes from because several times through the play someone says, we've got to get these picked before night come. And there are some outsiders in the group. There was like a kid who's like a teddy boy, back just dates it to the early 60s. There's a student from the university, and there's this rather dotty old Irish tramp called Roach, who insists that he's a great poet and is always about as much use as there's no use. Everyone else is like filling buckets with pears. He'll walk on. I think the stage direction is enter Roach bearing majestically one pear.
Exactly.
A lot.
He's Mr. Tits on a Ball. And he is absolutely the outsider.
And in many ways, it's a very funny play. There's a lot of kind of recurring things. Like there's a fellow called Johnny Hobnails who's like they let him out from the local asylum basically, and the main thing that it's implied that he's mainly been locked up because he's illegitimate, and also because he's gay, and there's this kind of very sub rosa kind of gay attraction between him and the young student Larry, and he is aware that there is this mood of slowly building menace, that all these the aggressions and pent up fears and anxieties and stuff of all these ordinary labourers are building up to a point where they are going to find an outlet, and they have to find that outlet, and he's afraid it's going to be the student, and so he focuses on saving them, and instead they turn on Roach, the Irishman. And it's an incredibly, through the second act, this incredibly slowly building menace and aggression towards him. And apparently Rudkin based this on an experience of his own. He was like he was working in an orchard, basically. He was basically the student, and there was this character called Roach, and he said, you know, they were all slashing up old tires with knives for some purpose, and he'd been fired by them, but he was still hanging around trying to take part. And he said they talked through him as if he wasn't there. And because his father was a revivalist minister, he remembered thinking, in a Christian sense, they're murdering this man.
It's like shunning. It's like the idea of being shunned. You know, you no longer exist.
The play basically does the play basically makes that literal. There's a helicopter or something flying over, spraying the crops. So there's this kind of glistening haze falls over the stage, and they finally turn on him, carve a cross on his chest, pin him down, crush a pitchfork into his neck, and hack his head off. How the fuck they did this on stage? And apparently, a woman on the first night of this, the people screamed horrified, and a woman fainted, and everything just froze and came to a halt because there was commotion in the audience, and someone kind of slapping her face to bring her out. And then this very authoritative voice barked, "Shut up and listen." And the play went on. And he turned out that was Harold Pinter, who'd been in the audience that night.
That is amazing. Yeah. So often with folk horror, there's this feeling that you are reproducing something from ages past. It's like ritualistically, it communicates itself to you, and you don't even know how it happens, but you end up doing over what was done before, either to complete something that was not completed, or simply to mimic it. And, one of the best examples of this that I can think of is, of course, the Owl Service by Alan Garner. Which takes its cues from Welsh mythology, which is so fucking weird anyways. It's like Welsh mythology. I mean, people talk about, there's this guy, Dan Cummins, who does a podcast I listen to called Time Suck. And at one point he was talking about Celtic mythology, and he kind of stopped in the middle of it, and he was like, "Oh my God, this stuff is just so weird." And it's true. Yeah. Celtic mythology is some of the weirdest mythology ever, because stuff is always turning into other stuff. It's really protoplasmic. It's really, it's like, and then he just did this, and nobody knows why.
That's not necessarily the end. And I always, of course, there's one Welsh hero called Bran the Blessed, and I whenever I see that name, I just think of Brian Blessed, which kind of confuses the.
Yeah, he's just walking around Wales going, ha, 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 ha.
Let's say Brian Blessed with a Welsh accent. That would just be,
magnificent.
Lad. And he's fairly a force of nature. I mean, the interesting thing as well about this whole thing of the kind of the ritual compulsive behavior, this stuff can either have a supernatural or magical, mythical underpinning, or it can have an entirely psychological underpinning, or you can have this thing where it's there's this very kind of liminal. Is this purely, is this something that's explicable purely in terms of psychology of one kind or another, individual or mob, or
things go wrong, you have to pay to get them to go the way that you want them to. And particularly when you're dependent on nature, and nature cannot be controlled. I mean, it can be, to some degree, we think it can be, particularly in terms of stuff like, stuff like hunting and stuff like farming. There's this sense that you can tame the land, that you can shepherd it, that you can, make it do the things that it's going to do naturally, but make it do them twice as hard, make it do them where you want them to be done, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact is that you cannot control the weather, and you cannot control you cannot control how things grow or why things grow or where things grow. And you cannot
Here's the
control.
parallel with cosmic horror again, because you might be you're just tending this one little plot, and your main concern is, can I get the potatoes to come up? But that is dependent on so many other kind of things, and climate change and all the rest of it. These huge forces. I mean, and especially if you were like a medieval peasant or something, it would be completely incomprehensible. That can just. I mean, I remember reading about. There's a fascinating book called The Lost Village of Britain by Richard Muir, which looks at the various settlements that have been deserted over the years, and a lot of the time, of course, it's because rich, powerful people decided they wanted rid of this particular settlement for whatever reason, but not always. And some of it
I want to build my house here, yeah.
A lot of them, like the deer parks that were set up in medieval times or Tudor times, where it was like, well, we need to get rid of these villages so we can build the park. And the villagers was like, fuck off, we don't need you anymore. Hit the road, and we don't give a shit where what happens to you. But as well, there were some settlements that were abandoned because as the climate changed, like the Little Ice Age in the 14th century, it was no longer possible to farm there. Yeah. So they suddenly became uninhabitable. So there is this whole thing that you're living on this little island in a sea of ignorance kind of thing, and these huge greater forces that that you don't understand. You can only hope to propitiate, perhaps, in some way.
Yeah. The swamp gets wider and your village disappears. The river overflows and your village disappears. The sea breaks in and your village disappears. There's actually, in terms of gardening, there's a wonderful folk horror book that was done about, I think, 2 years ago by a guy named James Brogden called Bone Harvest.
Oh, I haven't read it yet.
Oh, it's amazing. It's really, really good. And one of the things that I love about it, well, there are several things that I love about it, but the main character is a woman who is, she's got early onset dementia. And so she's dealing with that, but she's also part of this gardening club where, it's like common gardens, and she has this garden that she cares for, and sometimes she ends up sleeping in the shed that's next to her gardening plot. And more and more she begins to realize that, some people's gardens super flourish and she's not entirely sure why. And it turns out it's because there is in fact a cult that worships a pig god or a boar god from like prehistoric times. And it's this kind of amazing thing where you summon the boar god and it lets you eat it. And then and grind its bones down into meal, and then you use the bone meal in your garden.
Wow. I mean, in a way, it kind of reminds me of Adam Neville's The Reddening, except that you're the one who's getting eaten, not the beast, in that scenario.
Oh, believe me, it comes to that in some ways. But yeah, it's like there's this real amazing thing of, it's like that's the kind of self-sacrificing God I want. This kind of self-sacrificing God I want is the kind that'll let me eat him and then shit him back out, and then he grows again.
Giant prehistoric pig Jesus.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. It's like you can keep your skinny white man on a couple of sticks. It's like, I don't know what I get out of that. Come on. But
Adam Neville is probably one of the leading proponents of folk horror. I mean, with stuff like these days, with the reddening, with the ritual, cunning folk. I mean, I think Last Days, is that, I mean, how much of a folk?
Last Days is sort of, yes, I would call it folk horror as well, because it revolves around a piece of lost history.
Yeah.
Yeah, a piece of history that most people just don't know about at all.
Kind of, well, House of Small Shadows as well, probably.
Oh, yeah.
It's
House of Small Shadows is fascinatingly weird.
one of the most amazingly fucked up and brilliant horror novels.
Yeah, exactly. And often he does that beautiful thing where he doesn't tell you everything. And it's not because he doesn't know it. It's because there's no way that his characters could find out about it.
Yeah. And in many ways, having when you've got, it's often that thing when you've got those tantalizing fragments that point you towards something greater, that can be more effective than spilling the whole beans. I mean, you just see a fragment of one of the so-called cruelty plays, a hint, and you hear some of the names of the so-called martyrs of this strange religion, but you don't really find
religious subcult. Okay, so there are two things I want to talk about, and the first one is this idea of ritual coming down to us, like lost knowledge coming down to us as fragments. When you think about it, two great examples are, of course, Ring a Ring a Rosie and London Bridge is Falling Down. This idea that, is London Bridge is Falling Down really about, burying somebody in the foundations of the bridge, alive, possibly, to keep the bridge from falling down? Is it really about that? Is it a choosing song, and what happens to the person who's chosen? I actually found it very interesting that fairly recently I was going through a bunch of yokai. There is a because I saw 3 yokai movies that have just popped up on Shudder, like 100 Monsters, Night Parade of 100 Monsters, and Spook Warfare, where a bunch of Japanese yokai fight an invasive Babylonian monster spirit that shows up in Japan. And the third one I think is called Among the Ghosts. Okay, so yokai are folkloric creatures from the older animistic traditions of Japan, and sometimes they're filtered through Buddhist thought. There are a lot of things called something priest. For example, it sort of looks like a priest, but it's sort of not a priest. Giant priest, one-eyed priest, little boy priest, horrible little boy priest, etc. But these are things that you can find like roaming around in the night, and you look at them at the corner of your eye, and you're like, that's not a person. Okay, well, I'm just going to move quickly away.
Usually the wisest thing to do in such circumstances.
Yeah, exactly. And one of these creatures, and of course I can't remember the name, but one of these creatures is known as a human pillar. And a human pillar is a yokai which grows out of the ghost of a person who has been buried underneath the weight-bearing pillar of a house.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Do you know any of Helen Dunmore's fiction?
Yes.
There's a story of hers called The Bridge Painter.
Oh.
Which, I mean, and again, it's completely not non-supernatural.
Right.
But it's this guy who he paints bridges, and he's on a ferry that's crossing, I think, between Sweden and Denmark, because they have this big bridge that they've built across the strait between the two countries.
Oh yeah, yeah.
He talks about and he has this thing where he's talking to the reader, and he's kind of recognizing that the sort of what he's saying maybe sort of creeping them out. Oh, well, we're going to have to do something about him. Not if you don't want to, just sit on this. And you realize he's totally fallen in with this idea of how you have to set a watchman, how that song is about. But
That's
what
right.
he does is he gets one of those, he gets like
Set a
a
man to watch all night.
yeah. But
My
his
fair
idea is
lady.
he gets like a realistic baby doll, the kind that makes the crying sound and everything, and he sets them in.
Yeah.
And that's his watchman. But he's saying, "Oh, now I've got to set my watchman." And the thing is, how's he going to actually get to the bridge? And he's like, and the last line is, "The water's so flat you could believe you could walk on it." And so it is a story in one way about insanity,
Yeah.
but not of a kind that's actually dangerous to anybody else, except possibly the poor bastard who's about to try and jump off the boat and
Yes.
plant a baby and doll in this bridge's foundations to stop it falling down.
Yeah, exactly. And, there, you have this sense that maybe something older is working on this guy's brain, this guy's imagination, that maybe he's seized onto this fragment of ritual. And he's, and it's become it's dug into his brain, like a piece of, shell and sand, digs into, and starts irritating the oyster. Creates a pearl, but the pearl is a pearl of insanity.
This was the first of a 3-part podcast discussing folk horror. Join us next time when we look more closely at the Owl Service, along with European folk horror on Netflix and the unique horror vision of George Popov in his superb horror film The Droving, and much, much else besides. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the podcast, please feel free to make a donation through our Patreon or our Ko-Fi pages.
Until then, I have been Simon Bestwick.
And I have been Gemma Files.
And this has been, of course, No
Darkness but ours.